Tonight, we dive into the surprisingly well-recorded, yet often misrepresented, everyday life of prostitutes in ancient Rome. Imagine waking up, more accurately, regaining consciousness, in a tiny, dim room barely big enough to stand in. This is your home and workspace rolled into one, most likely a windowless chamber tucked into a brothel, lupanar, or stacked above a tavern or bathhouse. These spaces were minimally furnished, often unsanitary, and reeked of wine, smoke, and lingering disappointment. You might own a few essentials, some makeup, a comb, maybe a bronze mirror if times are good. Bathing. That's a group activity at a nearby public bath, where the water is shared and the awkwardness is free. Privacy doesn't really exist here. Walls are thin, and doors are optional. Your day starts with tidying up your cramped quarters, clearing away last night's remnants, wine spills, dust, and maybe a forgotten sandal. Then comes the preparation. Face powder, blush, and strong perfume, not to smell pleasant, but to outdo the stench of the clientele. A half-hearted smile in your bronze mirror is as much for you as it is for your customers. Every day feels rushed, confined, but with just enough dignity to get you to the next one. Forget private bathrooms. That luxury is reserved for the wealthy. You might use a public fountain for a quick rinse, hoping it hasn't been used to wash poultry. Soap wasn't common, but some used natron, a coarse, salt-based powder. If funds allowed, you might visit the communal bathhouse, rubbing shoulders with everyone from merchants to philosophers, scraping off dirt with a strigil and applying heavy makeup to hide fatigue, not to enhance beauty. In Roman society, clothes carried strong social messages. Respectable women wore stolas, signaling virtue and marital status. Prostitutes, however, were legally required to wear short, often bright-colored togas, a visual cue of their trade. They accessorized with cheap jewelry and styled their hair in curled or dyed wigs, often blonde, imported from Gaul. Makeup was heavy. White face powder, red lips, and thick eyeliner. The goal wasn't elegance, but visibility. You had to stand out to attract customers. In ancient Rome, there were no flyers or websites. Visibility was key. If you worked from a brothel, its location near baths, markets, or taverns was strategic. You stood in the doorway dressed to attract, calling out deals. Freelancers hung around temples or taverns looking to charm tipsy passers-by. Graffiti was also a powerful marketing tool. Walls bore testimonials like "Maritimus was excellent" or "Felicia 2 denarii, quick service." These served as ancient Yelp reviews, bold, public, and unfiltered. Success depended as much on marketing as skill. Setting prices was a brutal game of supply, demand, and whatever you could get away with before someone tried to pay in stale bread. Lower-tier sex workers often earned just a few small coins, less than the price of lunch, while others accepted food, sandals, or vague promises. At the higher end, elite sex workers known as meretrices charged in silver denarii, offering not just physical services but conversation, music, and poetry. Some carved niches for themselves, sailors, entertainers, or even those who recited poetry during sex. Repeat clients might get discounts or not, depending on their attitude or hygiene. Those working under a pimp or brothel owner lost much of their earnings, while enslaved women saw none at all, just shelter and a glimmer of hope to buy freedom one day. Brothels, called lupanars from the word for she-wolf, Roman slang for prostitute, were usually cramped two-story buildings wedged between the taverns and bathhouses. Inside was a hallway lined with tiny cubicles, each with a stone bed and thin curtain for privacy. You shared the space with other women and a Lino or Lena, pimp or madam, who took a hefty cut and yelled about repairs that never happened. Clients ranged from boys with shaky hands to senators pretending this was a philosophical field trip. Graffiti adorned the walls with reviews like, "Felix was here twice," or "Ties gives a good time." The job wasn't glamorous, but it came with a roof and a front row seat to humanity's strangest parade. If brothels were cubicle farms, taverns were chaotic startups. Here you served cheap wine to drunk soldiers and merchants while trying not to get groped. Some women worked in back rooms, doubling the tavern as a part-time brothel. Others flirted just enough to encourage spending, sometimes adding lap-sitting or seductive compliments like, "Your toga looks clean." Payment had to be immediate, no credit. And if someone refused to pay, there was always a grumpy ex-gladiator bouncer nearby. The job was part waitress, part therapist, part hostage negotiator, and nobody tipped for emotional labor. Freelancers, prostibulae, wandered markets, alleys, and temple steps, dressed in short tunics and bright wigs to stand out. Catching a client's eye before his wife did was part of the job. You had to act fast, flirt, name your price, and hope the street guards didn't call it public disorder. You competed with everyone, from fellow workers to drunk party girls to gladiators moonlighting for extra coin. Some carried knives or stuck close to friendly tavern bouncers. It was risky and exposed, but it meant keeping your profits and your independence. The Roman government taxed sex workers under a levy called vectigul ex capturis. Public officials known as publicani collected it, often judging you with every scribble on their wax tablets. To legally work, you had to register with Roman inspectors, aediles, and sometimes be branded or tattooed to prevent you from ever passing as respectable. You paid per act or per week, with no deductions for trauma, awkward clients, or emotional toll. Skip payments, and you risked arrest or losing the right to work. Rome essentially said, "We condemn your job, but also demand a cut." While sex work was legal and taxed, everyone in power loved to judge it. Senators preached virtue while keeping brothel tabs. Aediles enforced cleanliness laws and fined women for being too obvious, even when the law required them to be. Writers like Juvenal mocked sex workers while writing suspiciously detailed descriptions of their lives. Matrons, the elite Roman wives, glared from across the street, petitioned to ban prostitutes from baths or jewelry, all while their husbands visited the very places they condemned. It was a system built on double standards, public disapproval, private indulgence. Diseases were rampant. Rome didn't have germ theory, but people knew when something wasn't right down there. Remedies included vinegar washes, herbal pastes, and prayers to Venus. Birth control methods were crude. Extinct plants like silphium, wool tampons soaked in herbs, or animal intestines. Some women carried pregnancies to term, others left babies at foundling homes or, tragically, on the street. There were no real medical options, just wine, opium, and maybe a slap from your madam to toughen up. Emotional health? You had fellow workers, stray cats, and hope. That was it. Despite society's moral judgment, sex workers were deeply spiritual. Many worshipped Venus, the goddess of love, asking for charm clients, or at least better-smelling visitors. Fortuna, goddess of luck, was also a favorite. After all, income varied wildly. Protection spells, red ankle cords, and even curse tablets to fictiones were common. These were written to destroy a rival's luck or clientele. May her clients dry up. may she fall in dung. If enslaved, you might pray to Mercury, god of commerce, or Libertas, the goddess of freedom. The gods were your only shot at decent HR support. Love happened. Sort of. Clients fell in love all the time, usually after 3 cups of wine. Some women played along, others grew attached, and a few dared to believe they could escape through romance. But Roman law labeled sex workers infames, barring them from legal marriage to citizens. Some clients made grand promises: freedom, marriage, a house. Most vanished after meeting someone else. Real connections were more likely among fellow workers, sisterhoods, quiet romances, or just shared exhaustion. Many clung to dreams, saving enough to leave, open a perfume shop, or just live without judgment. Youth was currency, and aging meant fading income. But older sex workers didn't vanish. Some saved enough to retire, open taverns, or become madams. Others turned to fortune-telling or advising younger women with sarcasm and herbal remedies. Many kept working. Older clients appreciated discretion and a good story. Reputation mattered just as much as looks, but without savings or luck, some ended up begging, cleaning temples, or working until the hands gave out. There were no pensions, but surviving to old age with your wit intact made you a legend in your own right. Roman prostitutes weren't just background figures. They were a visible, necessary part of daily life, etched into graffiti, legal codes, and satirical poetry. They were erased from the history books, but not from the walls, the receipts, or the stories whispered across centuries. Their power wasn't in fame or statues, but in survival. They navigated a society that judged them, used them, and taxed them, and still found ways to laugh, hustle, dream, and live. So next time someone celebrates the glory of Rome, remember, it wasn't built on marble alone. It ran on grit, gossip, and women in togas who knew exactly what they were doing. In Viking life, where injury from war or daily toil was common, the healer, or lechnir, was both a medical expert and spiritual guide. One of their go-to herbs was yarrow, Achillea millefolium, prized for stopping bleeding. Crushed leaves were applied to wounds, often paired with ritual chants to invoke divine help. Yarrow also worked internally, as tea to soothe fevers, cramps, or digestive troubles. For the Vikings, healing wasn't just physical, it was sacred, connecting people to gods like Odin, whom some believed gave the plant its power. Angelica, Archangelica, thrived in the North's cold climate. Healers used its root in teas and salves to fight infections, reduce inflammation, and boost circulation. It was especially useful for wounds and respiratory illness. Spiritually, Angelica was viewed as a divine gift. In Norse tradition, it may have been tied to protection and female health. Used during childbirth and menstruation, its strong scent and healing potency made it central to rituals meant to ward off illness or purify homes. As winter faded, Viking healers collected birch sap, a clear, slightly sweet liquid. It rehydrated, revitalized, and was believed to restore energy after illness. Rich in minerals and electrolytes, it helped with fevers and fatigue. Sometimes fermented, sometimes mixed with herbs, birch sap marked the renewal of the seasons. Symbolically, birch represented purity and new beginnings, a perfect match for its medicinal uses. Juniper's berries and branches had multiple uses: teas for kidney health, smoke for purifying the air, and salves for infections. Juniper smoke disinfected homes and ships after disease. Its aromatic strength was believed to repel spirits and sickness alike. In steam baths, It opened lungs and drew out toxins. Juniper stood at the intersection of hygiene and spiritual defense, a medicinal guardian against the seen and unseen. Meadowsweet, Filipendula ulmaria, grew in damp fields and was used to reduce fevers and pain, especially joint aches, headaches, and stomach issues. The Vikings didn't know it, but this herb contains compounds similar to modern aspirin. Its sweet scent and gentle effect made it a favorite, especially in tea blends. It was also placed near the sick or the dead as a comforting bridge between this world and the next. Mugwort, Artemisia vulgaris, was a healer's favorite for both body and soul. Medicinally, it treated cramps, digestive issues, and fatigue. Spiritually, it was used in dreams, rituals, and protection spells. Burned or steeped, mugwort soothed nightmares and prepared warriors for sleep. Seeresses and healers used it during divination ceremonies. Hanging it over doors or carrying it on journeys gave protection. Mugwort was a threshold herb used in times of transition, healing, and prophecy. Not native to Scandinavia but traded widely, garlic, Allium sativum, was a warrior's defense. Crushed garlic cleaned wounds and fought infections. When eaten raw or brewed, it supported immunity and treated respiratory issues. Combined with honey, it became a powerful tonic. Garlic also repelled parasites, especially intestinal worms. Spiritually, it was hung in homes for protection, especially during war, childbirth, or plague. Before raids, some Vikings even consumed garlic for inner strength and resilience. Stinging nettle, Urtica dioica, was as common as it was respected. Brewed into teas or broths, it replenished iron, boosted circulation, and treated fatigue. It helped joints, cured bloating, and restored strength after illness. Surprisingly, healers also used urtication, slapping limbs with fresh nettle to stimulate warmth and ease arthritis. Its fibers were made into ropes or cloth, adding to its usefulness. Symbolically, nettle represented resilience, painful at first, but deeply healing. Healing knowledge in Viking society passed mostly through women, mothers, midwives, and wise women called valor. They blended herbal practice with Norse spirituality, understanding seasonal rhythms and plant lore. Illness wasn't just physical. It was seen as imbalance, fate, or divine challenge. Healing rituals invoked gods like Freya or Frigg and used herbs both for treatment and spiritual realignment. As Christianity spread, this body of knowledge faded or was absorbed by monasteries. Some herbs, like angelica, were adopted to Christian healing. Others, like mugwort, were demonized as pagan. Yet the legacy survives in folk medicine, oral traditions, and today's interest in ancestral plant wisdom. Viking herbalism was holistic, healing body, mind, and soul with what the land offered. The visions told her to drive out the English and ensure the Dauphin Charles was crowned king. At first, she kept them secret. By 1428, as Orléans was under siege, she felt compelled to act. She persuaded a local commander to send her to Charles, claiming divine instruction. Despite being a teenage peasant girl, her sincerity impressed many. She traveled through hostile land, dressed as a man, and reached Charles's court. Charles tested her by hiding among courtiers. Joan recognized him instantly. After theological vetting, she was allowed to join the army. She requested armor, a banner bearing Jesus Maria, and a sword she claimed was divinely revealed. She was now ready to march to Orleans. In April 1429, Joan entered the besieged city, clad in white armor, on a white horse. Her arrival electrified morale. Though untrained, she urged aggressive attacks and fought alongside soldiers, rallying them with her banner. Even after being shot with an arrow, she returned to the field. On May 8th, the English retreated. The victory was decisive, and her legend was born. Joan believed her mission included crowning Charles in Reims, deep in enemy territory. Her determination inspired the army, and as towns surrendered along the way, the path cleared. On July 17, 1429, Charles was crowned. Joan stood beside him, banner raised. She had fulfilled her prophecy, transforming the war into a holy cause. Joan now pressed to reclaim Paris. But Charles, cautious and politically entangled, hesitated. When he finally approved an attack in September, it was half-hearted. Joan led the charge, was wounded by a crossbow, and continued to fight. But the city held. Her influence at court began to wane. In 1430, Joan tried to defend Compiègne from Burgundian forces. During battle, the city gates closed too early. She was captured, held for ransom, and sold to the English. Her status as a national symbol made her a high-value prisoner. In Rouen, the English orchestrated a church trial to discredit her. She was interrogated repeatedly by pro-English clergy. Despite threats, she remained composed and faithful to her visions. When asked if she was in God's grace, she famously replied, "If I am not, may God place me there." Her refusal to renounce her voices and wear women's clothes sealed her fate. On May 30th, 1431, at just 19, Joan was burned at the stake. Her final words were prayers to Jesus. Witnesses, including some of her enemies, were moved. One English soldier exclaimed, "We have burned a saint." Her death was meant to silence her, but it made her a martyr. In 1456, a church investigation posthumously cleared her name. Over centuries, Joan became a symbol of courage, faith, and nationalism. She was canonized in 1920. Today, she stands as one of history's most enduring figures. A teenage girl who changed the fate of a nation through vision, faith, and fire. Joan's rise from a rural, illiterate peasant girl to a military leader who stood beside a king was nothing short of miraculous. She came from a modest home, raised in prayer and hard work. Her faith wasn't born in cathedrals, but in local chapels and fields, and yet she stepped onto the world stage with unshakable conviction that she was chosen by God. Her visions and her belief in them gave her the strength to face ridicule, danger, and death. Joan's story shattered expectations. In a world dominated by men and hierarchy, she defied every rule. She wore men's armor, led troops, and issued commands with divine confidence. Her actions blurred gender roles, questioned social class boundaries, and upended ideas of who could claim authority. And because of that, she frightened the powerful. The trial that condemned her was less about religion and more about politics, a desperate attempt to erase a girl who had proven unstoppable. Though the church condemned her, it was also the church that later redeemed her. Over 2 decades after her execution, Joan was exonerated in a retrial that declared her innocence and invalidated the charges. In time, she became a national symbol, a figure of patriotism and sanctity. When France needed heroes, Joan's story was always waiting, etched into stained glass banners and monuments. Joan was declared a saint in 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her death. Today, she is revered not just as a warrior saint, but as a symbol of courage in the face of oppression. Her life has inspired books, films, paintings, and political movements. And while much of her life is shrouded in myth, the core truth remains. A young girl listened to her conscience, defied her doubters, and altered the course of history. Joan's story is not just about battles and visions. It's about holding on to what you believe, even when the world calls you foolish or dangerous. It's about the power of conviction, the strength of belief, and the courage to speak truth to power, no matter the cost. For a 19-year-old girl, that cost was everything. But her legacy became something no fire could destroy. Nearly 5 centuries after her execution, the Catholic Church officially recognized Joan's sanctity. In 1920, she was canonized as Saint Joan of Arc. The church that had once allowed her to be tried and executed as a heretic now held her up as a model of virtue, courage, and divine faith. This transformation reflected both a national need for unity in post-World War I France and the Church's attempt to reconcile with its own historical failures. Joan became not only a religious figure, but a unifying national symbol of resistance, purity, and conviction. Joan's image evolved far beyond the church pews. She became a character in literature, an icon in cinema, and a symbol for women's rights, nationalism, and spiritual devotion. Writers, artists, revolutionaries, and even generals found inspiration in her unshakable commitment. From Shakespeare to George Bernard Shaw, from Carl Dreyer's silent films to modern biographies, Joan continues to live in the global imagination. Each retelling adapts her to the needs of the era, sometimes saint, sometimes soldier, always unbreakable. Though historians debate the details, what Joan truly said, whether her visions were spiritual or psychological, the broader truth is clear. Joan was a force. A teenager from a remote village who, with nothing but conviction, walked into royal courts, led armies, and stood defiant against the most powerful men of her age. She was burned to silence her, but her name is louder today than ever. Her story reminds us that even those history tries to erase, women, the poor, the misunderstood, can shape the world in ways no one expects. The sun over Alexandria burned differently than in Rome, lower, whiter, ancient. It lit stone columns older than Christ, passed over scrolls packed tighter than wheat in ships, and danced on the white robes of men who debated the nature of God with clenched fists. In the middle of it all was a woman who refused to choose between the stars and the soul. Her name was Hypatia. She was the last light of Alexandria, and the world that could not understand her would not let her live. She was born without fanfare in the ancient city of Alexandria around 355 A.D., in a world perched precariously between fading Roman tolerance and the rising power of the Christian Church. Her name was Hypatia, daughter of the mathematician Theon, and from an early age she was trained not as a daughter, but as a successor. She studied mathematics, astronomy, and Neoplatonic philosophy, mastering subjects considered the exclusive domain of men. At a time when Roman women were expected to marry and remain veiled, Hypatia stood before crowds of elite male students, lecturing on celestial harmonies, logic, and the writings of Plato. She wore the robes of a philosopher, remained unmarried by choice, and became the most respected intellectual in a city famed for knowledge. Alexandria was no longer the city of scrolls and scholars it had once been. By the end of the 4th century, the empire had declared Christianity its official religion. Pagan temples were destroyed, philosophers were cast out, and church authority filled the vacuum left by a retreating Roman state. Still, Hypatia taught. Her students came from across the empire, from Christians and pagans alike. One of her closest was Orestes, the Roman governor of Egypt, who came to rely on her counsel as religious tensions in Alexandria escalated. Opposing Orestes was Cyril, the ambitious and zealous bishop of Alexandria, determined to unite the city under his spiritual rule. Hypatia, a woman and a pagan who advised his political rival, became a threat to be eliminated. Whispers turned to rumors that she used magic, that she had bewitched Orestes, that she stood in the way of God's will. In March 415 A.D., those whispers turned violent. A mob of Christian extremists, believed to be Pr0stitutes, men who served the bishop under the guise of charity, intercepted Hypatia as she traveled through the city. They dragged her from her chariot, stripped her in the street, and beat her to death with roof tiles. Some accounts say they flayed her skin. Others say they burned her body in a public square, attempting to erase not only her life, but her legacy. No one was punished. Bishop Cyril was not condemned. He was later canonized as a saint. Hypatia's death marked more than the end of a brilliant life. It symbolized the silencing of classical knowledge, of scientific inquiry, and of women in intellectual public life. The Library of Alexandria would continue to crumble. The Roman Empire would fall, but Hypatia's name would survive. Muslim astronomers later quoted her in preserved fragments. Enlightenment thinkers elevated her as a martyr of reason. Early feminists saw in her a symbol of what women could be if allowed to learn and lead. In modern times, her story has returned in books, films, and philosophy classrooms, not just as a tale of injustice, but as a warning. Hypatia did not lead armies like Joan of Arc, nor curse rivals like Roman prostitutes trying to survive the Suburra. She did not brew remedies under the northern lights like Viking healers. She taught, she calculated, she advised, she resisted, and for that she was murdered. Yet what her killers sought to extinguish, her voice, her brilliance, her defiance, became a fire that has never fully gone out. In every girl who opens a math book, in every woman who speaks truth to power, in every moment when reason challenges fear, Hypatia of Alexandria lives again. She was born in 1745 on the island of São Domingos, now Haiti, to an enslaved African woman and a French plantation owner. At birth, she was called Joseph Boulogne. History would remember him differently, as Chevalier de Saint-Georges, but behind his name was a woman who existed in the shadows of his fame, Nanon, his mother. Hers is the story barely written in the history books, yet everything he became began with her survival. Nanon was enslaved, possibly captured in Senegal or another part of West Africa, and shipped across the Atlantic to the brutal sugar plantations of the Caribbean, where death rates among the enslaved were higher than anywhere else in the Americas. Yet she endured. She gave birth to Joseph, and when her master, Georges de Boulogne, decided to take his son to France for education, she went with them. This was rare. French law allowed enslaved people brought to mainland France to petition for freedom. Nanon was freed, at least on paper, and lived in Paris with her son. But freedom didn't mean equality. While Joseph was enrolled in elite schools and trained in music, fencing, and mathematics, Nanon remained largely invisible to the social circles he entered. Her son excelled. Joseph became a champion fencer, defeating white noblemen in duels across Paris. He played violin with astonishing talent, eventually joining the orchestra of Le Concert des Amateurs, and within 2 years he became its conductor. He composed symphonies, operas, and quartets. By the 1770s, he was known as the Black Mozart, though Mozart would later borrow from him, not the other way around. And through all of this, Nanon remained by his side. She attended his performances, sometimes seated at the back, often ignored. She didn't speak at salons. She didn't dine with nobility, but she had raised him, protected him, and walked into rooms where no black woman had ever been welcome. France was still a slave empire. Racism flourished beneath the powdered wigs of Enlightenment thinkers. Voltaire could preach liberty while owning enslaved people in the colonies. Even as her son was praised for his genius, Nanon felt the weight of what had been stripped from her homeland, her name, her future. When Joseph was denied the role of director at the Paris Opera, despite unanimous recommendation, it was said that 3 leading divas refused to serve under a man of color. The same salons that celebrated his artistry whispered jokes behind his back. But Nanon knew what he didn't say. She had lived through the unspoken rules of whiteness. She had seen the way wealth and skin braided themselves into hierarchy. She reminded him, often quietly, that talent didn't erase ancestry. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Joseph sided with the Republic. He led an all-black regiment known as the Legion Saint-Georges, fighting for liberty in the very country that still profited from plantations like the one where he had been born. Meanwhile, Nanon remained in Paris, living modestly, watching the city tear itself apart with idealism and blood. Her son, once celebrated in Versailles, was now hunted by royalists and distrusted by Jacobins alike. In 1793, Joseph was arrested and imprisoned without trial. The revolution had turned on its heroes, and the world had once again reminded him that black men were only welcome when useful, never when powerful. Nanon visited when she could, risking her own safety. She was old now, moving slower, her hair braided in silence. But she had known prison before. She had known chains. She had watched people whipped and burned, and still she had walked through fire to raise a boy who would one day write music that moved kings to tears. Joseph was released after nearly a year, but his orchestra was gone. His influence had vanished. France had changed. He spent his final years in relative obscurity, teaching music and living in a small apartment. Nanon died before him. No portrait was painted, no eulogy written. But the women who washed her body spoke of how she hummed her son's symphonies as she aged, how she never forgot the taste of sugarcane, and how she wept silently the first time she saw him conduct. Chevalier de Saint-Georges died in 1799. His music, once widely celebrated, was erased in the 19th century as France struggled to reconcile its revolutionary ideals with its colonial past. For over a century, his name vanished from concert halls. But now, scholars and musicians are reclaiming his legacy, publishing his scores, performing his operas, and telling his story. And in doing so, they begin to glimpse the woman history forgot. Nanon, a mother, a survivor, a ghost who stood beside greatness and never asked to be seen. Her fingerprints are on every note. She didn't compose symphonies, but she composed resilience. She didn't fence in duels, but she fought every day. She didn't ride horses with the aristocracy, but she carried the future of black European identity in her arms. To speak of Chevalier de Saint-Georges is to speak of Nanon, and to remember her is to challenge every history book that writes genius without asking who bore its weight. Her life is a quiet revolution, buried beneath centuries of powdered wigs and silenced truths. But when you hear the violin rise beneath the chandeliers of a Paris concert hall somewhere, even now, her breath is in the bow. The Vikings loved to fight not only because it brought them wealth or survival, but because their entire worldview was built around the idea that battle was sacred, heroic, and even divine. In their belief system, dying in battle was not a tragedy, but a victory, because it meant being chosen by powerful gods to enter the afterlife in a great warrior hall where fallen fighters would live forever. Their stories said that brave warriors who died with a weapon in hand would be taken by divine beings to feast, drink, and train for the final battle that would end the world. Because of this, they saw death in war as something to be proud of, not something to fear. Archaeologists have found graves filled with swords, shields, armor, and sometimes even horses or dogs, showing how much warriors expected to keep fighting even after death. At the same time, their society rewarded bravery. Men who fought well gained respect, influence, and honor. Even those who were born without land or wealth could rise in status if they proved themselves in battle. In their culture, personal reputation was everything, and winning in war was the best way to be remembered. Songs, poems, and stories told of heroes who won fights and earned glory that lasted beyond their lifetime. Economically, fighting was also practical. Scandinavia had limited farmland and harsh winters, which made survival difficult for large families. Since inheritance usually went to the oldest son, younger sons often had to find their fortune elsewhere. Raiding was a way to gain treasure, food, tools, and even people to enslave. Attacking churches and towns along rivers or coasts gave them fast rewards with low risk. Their ships were specially designed to move quickly and quietly through the water, allowing them to strike and retreat before local armies could respond. Politically, Europe at the time was weak and divided. Many areas had no strong rulers, which made them easy targets. This made raiding successful and profitable for years. On top of that, Viking fighters trained together in close groups that built strong bonds of loyalty. These groups acted like warrior families, where members trusted each other completely and shared the risks of battle. This made them more organized and effective than many of their enemies. Finally, their legends and stories taught that the only way to be remembered forever was to fight with courage. Their heroes were not kings or priests, but fearless fighters who faced death with pride. In their eyes, peace was temporary, but honor was eternal. To fight was to earn a name that people would speak long after the body was gone. That is why, across centuries and seas, the Vikings loved to fight, because for them, battle was not just survival, it was meaning, purpose, and the only path to immortality. In addition to their beliefs and ambitions, the Vikings also fought to assert dominance and protect their communities. Feuds between families or rival chieftains were common, and warfare often served as a tool for justice or revenge. Young men saw battle as a rite of passage, proving their strength and loyalty. Their laws even allowed blood revenge, meaning violence was sometimes legally sanctioned. Fighting was also a way to expand influence, establish settlements, and control trade routes. As they explored new lands, conflict became necessary not just for survival, but for building power. For the Vikings, war was woven into every part of life. The Vikings also saw fighting as a way to maintain balance in a harsh and unpredictable world. Nature could be cruel. Storms, famine, and disease were constant threats. So displaying strength through battle helped them feel control over their fate. Warriors were admired not only for killing enemies, but for enduring pain. The samurai of feudal Japan lived according to a strict and complex code of conduct that shaped every part of their lives, from the way they fought to how they spoke, ate, and died. Their guiding principle was known as the Way of the Warrior, which demanded loyalty, discipline, courage, and complete devotion to one's master. Honor was the core of their identity. To lose it was worse than death, and so a disgraced samurai was expected to take his own life through ritual suicide, a practice called seppuku, to restore dignity to his name. But samurai were not just warriors with swords. They were also educated men who studied literature, philosophy, and the arts. Many wrote poetry, practiced calligraphy, and trained in music. They were taught to be calm, composed, and deadly. In battle, samurai used bows, spears, and later curved swords called katana. They wore layered armor made of iron and lacquered leather, often decorated with family crests and terrifying masks meant to intimidate opponents. Their training began in childhood, and they were taught to fight without hesitation, even against overwhelming odds. Alongside this deadly skill, they drank. Alcohol, especially sake, played a central role in samurai culture. It was used in religious ceremonies, war rituals, and celebrations. Before battles, some drank to calm their nerves or bond with comrades. After victory or defeat, sake was poured to honor the fallen or to reaffirm loyalty to a lord. Drinking was common, but excess was frowned upon if it interfered with duty or composure. As for women, the samurai class had complicated relationships. While some samurai wives were respected and managed estates in their husband's absence, most women were expected to obey male authority and preserve the family line. Love was secondary to alliance, and marriages were often arranged for political or economic reasons. Some high-ranking samurai kept courtesans or concubines, and in pleasure districts like Yoshiwara, elite warriors mingled with entertainers, poets, and performers. However, romantic or sexual indulgence was considered dangerous if it distracted from discipline. Female warriors, though rare, did exist. These women, known as onabugeisha, trained in the use of weapons like the naginata, and sometimes defended castles or fought alongside male samurai. While they were exceptions, their presence shows that the warrior code was not entirely reserved for men. In death, samurai were expected to meet their end with grace. Whether dying in combat or by their own hand, a samurai's final moments were a performance of loyalty and inner strength. They wrote death poems, cleaned their blades, and composed themselves to face eternity without fear. Their way of life began to fade in the 17th century when Japan entered a long period of peace. As wars disappeared, samurai roles shifted toward government, law enforcement, and ritual service. Still, they carried swords, maintained rank, and lived by the old codes even in changing times. The legacy of the samurai remains powerful because it was never just about fighting. It was about living with discipline, facing fear directly, and holding honor above all. For the samurai, battle was only one part of the warrior's path. The greatest struggle was mastering oneself. Samurai were more than just fighters. They were members of an elite social class that shaped Japan for centuries. They dressed in layered silk robes, carried two swords to mark their status, and lived by rules that demanded constant self-control. They were expected to serve their lords without question, and any sign of betrayal was punished by death. Many lived in castle towns and trained daily, even during peacetime. While some were wealthy, others struggled after long wars ended. As Japan unified under powerful shoguns, the need for constant fighting declined. Samurai became bureaucrats, tax collectors, or teachers, still holding rank but losing real power. By the 1800s, they were symbols more than soldiers. When Japan modernized in the late 19th century, the samurai class was officially abolished, but their legacy lived on in martial arts, literature, and the national idea of honor, sacrifice, and inner strength. As peace spread across Japan, many samurai lost their warrior role. Some became teachers, scribes, or guards. Others struggled with poverty, clinging to old values in a changing world. The sword, once a tool of war, became a symbol of pride. When Japan modernized in the 1800s, samurai privileges were removed. Many protested, but their time had ended. Even so, their code of honor remained, shaping Japanese identity for generations to come. When peace came, the samurai lost their purpose. Some adapted, others resisted. By the late 1800s, their status was gone. But their values, loyalty, honor, discipline, remained part of Japan's spirit.